episodes ago, I expressed my disdain for ORMs and ODMs. I find them either to be a design smell in your code or irrelevant. We're going to dive into the alternative as we work towards a better app structure. In this episode though, we're going to show how to handle user input without resorting to the crutch of an ODM. Let's start by asking some important questions. Is your data store your app, or is it just part of your app? Do you start working on a new app by first choosing database tables, or do you start working on your app by imagining what it should do and how it will benefit your users? I sure hope it's the latter. Your data store is just how you persist data. In an ideal world, your app for the most part shouldn't really care how you store your data. So let's move core app functionality out of your data persistence layer. Now, validating a new user is part of the request that creates the new user. Well, we can see the flow that creates a new user in config routes auth.js. We have our post here that calls user routes.create. And we can also see how it works in the route handler that currently serves this up in app routes auth user routes.js. Oy, what a mess. We're going to fix that, but for today, we're only worried about validating our user input. Now, if we're going to decouple validation from persistence, then we need a set of tools to perform those validations. Then we'll just need to hook those tools into our user creation flow. Our set of tools will come from the validator package. It provides a nice set of functions for validating various values. For example, is email we can use to see if a string is an email. Let's install it. npm install -- save validator. So far so good. Let's write a middleware that uses it. Open a new file at app middlewares validate new user.js. First, we drop our skeleton. Function validate new user, etc., etc. First, we need to get access to validator, so var validator equals require validator. Then we need to put our view object onto our request so that we can see it throughout the request cycle, like so. With that in place, we drop in some checks against the user's email input and password input, just with a couple of if statements. All we're doing is calling an appropriate function on validator, and if there's a problem, we make a note of it in our rec view errors object. Finally, we do something if we had some errors. We're just checking to see if either error condition got triggered, and if so, we create a new error object. We set that code property whose name we arbitrarily chose, so that our later error handling middleware can decide if they need to worry about this error. Then we return the error. If we didn't have any problems, we call next without any arguments. We've successfully written our input validation. If there were other fields we need to check, we could add them here. Now we need to hook this into our user creation flow, and we do so using the technique we learned in episode 44. Open config routes auth.js. Our first step is to get access to our new middleware. So var validate new user equals at middleware validate new user. Now we can inject it into our route declaration. And we should probably handle the error of invalid user input, so we'll need another middleware for that. Open a new file at app middlewares invalid new user error.js. We add the following code to it. We first lay down our skeleton, then we make sure that this error is one we care about in this middleware. If not, we punt. Then we generate an error string to which we append whatever errors we got in our validation. With that string generated, we simply render a response that is no worse than what we had before. Now, I'm not thrilled about this notes. I don't like that we're duplicating that error code string. We'll fix that with the new app structure. Also, I'm not thrilled about the way we build up this error string and give a lackluster response. I consider the baby step an improvement because our error response is no worse than it was before. In fact, it is slightly better because we actually know what was wrong now. Let's tie this into our route declaration back in config routes auth.js. First, we get access to the middleware, so we just require it and stick it in a variable. And then we can put this into our actual route, like so. Just put it there at the end. Now, we can't yet clean up the request handler because we might still get a database error when we try to save the new user. All we validated is that the user has given us good input. But if we were so inclined, we could make our model simpler. So let's open app models user.js. All we're doing here is pulling out the required option and the validate option from email and password hash, making this file simpler. Now we can fire up our server and see that the validation is still in place and that we have a more descriptive code base. With this setup, we can separate our validation by use case, and we haven't cut ourselves off from doing whatever we want with the database. In this episode, we decoupled our user validation from our persistence engine. In addition to making the code read more clearly, we could also now write actual unit tests that test our user creation. We're no longer tied to the database. And if you use the database, you're not doing a unit test. As we've been adding in some of these new ideas though, our app structure just isn't keeping up with the changes. Our files are getting messy, and it has become time for a change. Stay tuned as we work towards a better app structure. Until then, happy coding.